If you thought the previous chapters of this pre-alpha were bad, you haven't seen anything yet. This right here is the single worst chapter in this entire pre-alpha of a game. And that is not really saying much, because every single chapter on this pre-alpha is terrible. So, to correct myself, this is the worst chapter of a rotten bunch of chapters. Hello everyone, welcome to my Resident Evil 4 Remake. Professional difficulty, no damage, no new game plus items, no charms, worst through. Whether I'll be doing no merchant for the rest of this worst through, that remains to be seen. And this is Chapter 10, the chapter that is pretty much the personification of what is wrong with this game, and it just goes to show how deluded, dense, amateurish, and alien in thought the developers were when actually designing this chapter and this entire game. If you want to see exactly what this chapter is like, I've already released the next part of my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series, and it covers this entire chapter. I wanted to release that video before covering this walkthrough, because I can't really convey the number of problems present with this entire chapter properly in this video, so the Poor Designs video will at least suffice for that. But this chapter has everything in terms of poor designs. Too many enemies in single rooms, so many bad hitboxes, enemies that have a tremendous amount of life, enemies that get randomly stunned when they want to, enemies that spam grab like crazy, and it just goes to show how much this game's balancing is off when unarmed enemies are somehow more annoying than enemies with weapons, enemies that just spawn out of the blue and you can literally see them just pop into existence when you reach certain thresholds of a room. Enemies that have their AI turned off, so they just randomly choose to stand still, and they can hide around corners by doing this, thanks to this very broken design. Enemies that have weird pathfinding issues, and no more so is this the case than with the Garadors. The times where you expect them to go down one specific path, but then they take the long way around because of their awkward pathfinding, or the times where the Ganados in the middle of this Garador encounter decide to just go backwards, or they just run back to some zone that they were previously in. Combat encounters that are clearly designed with very specific pieces of ammunition in mind, like with the Garador encounter, or this encounter right here. This encounter right here, it feels like it was designed with the assault rifle in mind, but I could not get the assault rifle on this chapter for a really stupid reason. So it turns out, in Ashley's segment in Chapter 9, if you solve that clock puzzle that leads you down into the dungeon area too early without going into the library, you will not be able to have the stairs lowered to allow Leon to gain access to the assault rifle, which makes no fucking sense, guys. The thing I don't understand is, when you solve the clock puzzle early, and then you get the insignia, and then you're making your way out of the dungeon, there's a hidden door in the library that, if you're doing it normally, you normally open this door when there's one armadillo around and you're turning a crank, right? That's the hidden door that you normally open. But when you exit the dungeon after solving the clock puzzle early, that door is magically open. So they had the foresight to realize that people would solve that clock puzzle early, and so to complement that, they opened that hidden door up immediately, just magically out of the blue, so that people could use that to get out of there and finish the sequence. But if they had the foresight to realize this, why would they not instance that entire library area to have not only that hidden door open, but also the stairs open to allow you to gain access to the assault rifle? It makes no fucking sense. And the thing I don't understand is, the bookshelves that are actually blocking access to the crank that allows you to gain access to the hidden staircase, Leon could easily climb over those bookshelves if he tried. But the game does not allow you to do so. The prompt isn't there to mantle over those bookshelves. It's so fucking dumb. And when they clearly designed this sequence right here with the assault rifle in mind, because the assault rifle kills the Navistadors very quickly, or when you have the assault rifle with its like 3 times penetration power on weak spots, which clearly seems like it was befitting for the Garadors, why would New Capcom then try to punish people who wanted to get through Ashley's section quickly so that they could get to the parts that actually matter, which is the gameplay as Leon? It makes no sense, guys. And continuing this tangent on combat encounters that were clearly designed with one specific ammunition type in mind, the Garador encounter. Given how much of a clusterfuck the entire Garador encounter is, and if you want to see how much of a bad fight it is, check out my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series. You clearly want the player to use flash grenades like crazy, and at minimum, you need like 3 flash grenades in order to kill 1 Garador. And in order for the flash grenades to have full effect on a Garador's weak spot, you have to shoot the weak spot, expose the parasite, and then use the flash grenade. And also, by spamming flash grenades, you stun the other Garador and you stun the other enemies, so you can stop the reinforcements from spawning in, because the reinforcements that occur only trigger if you kill off the previous enemies in that wave, or if you leave like 1 enemy alive, because that's another way they can also spawn in. But why the fuck would they design the Garador encounter to be a flashbang fest? That just goes to show how little they understand their own designs in the previous chapters. When you're talking about the context of like no merchant, for instance, you have to obviously use the flash grenade to bypass poor designs in the previous chapters, and I've already shown just how badly designed the previous chapters of this game are. And you have to save up on all your flash grenades and just somehow find another way to bypass the poor designs in a less practical sort of way. And by saving those flash grenades, you can then deal with the Garadors. And also, the problem is, even when you do use all 6 of those flash grenades on the Garadors in order to kill them, you're going to be put into a bad situation when you start Chapter 11, and you get to one particular encounter of Chapter 11, and it's the double El Gigante boss fight, because that boss fight is terrible. It is a piece of shit fight if you do not have a flash grenade, and they do not bother giving back any static ammunition drops for flash grenades after the Garador encounter. You don't see anything in the room before Vertigo where you're dealing with those Navistador in the water area. You don't get any flash grenades in Vertigo's encounter. You don't get any flash grenades at the start of Chapter 11. You're pretty much in a no-win scenario with this fucking game if you decide to use all your flash grenades on those Garadors. And what I don't understand is, it's clear they're forcing the crafting upon you. It's clear that they're forcing all these fundamental mechanics into the merchant that are actually meant to benefit the fundamental flow of gameplay. And yet they still want to promote a restriction like no merchant. And you know, I got into a discussion about this with Ether and also with Juice regarding the topic of crafting. And Juice mentioned that it feels like the presence of crafting in this game has been used as a poor excuse by the developers to not have to think about what kind of supplies they should place in each section of the game. Most of what is available to you are either completely random drops or fixed drops that don't seem to have much thought put into them. Otherwise, there would have been a flash grenade inside of the El Gigante boss fight in Chapter 11, or before that encounter, after the Garador encounter in Chapter 10. There would have been shotgun shells and hand grenades in the Colmillo Mage, which is another example that he gave. They would have also given you more than meager scraps to work with in the cabin fight in all of Chapters 6 and 7. It's so easy to scrutinize every single section of this game in that regard. It should never have been this way. And he continues on by saying, for them to emphasize the crafting in this arbitrarily forced manner and then lock all of the extra recipes behind the merchant is laughably uniformed. And this suggests an embarrassing degree of unawareness of their own level design. As it stands, you need a stupid amount of forward knowledge just to make the game semi-playable. The crafting doesn't even service the pacing of this game anyway, not in exploration, and certainly not in combat. In every single instance, it is blatantly obvious what you need to craft, so all it does is add an extra tedious step. The game isn't benefiting from having more menu shuffling. So that right there was a really great point that Juice brought up. And also with Ether, they literally expect you to exploit the crafting/loot system to get the necessary ammunition needed. If you play conservatively by saving crafting resources, you get punished by not being given more. This game has a huge issue of arbitrarily deciding to just drop money too, and very little money per drop, which makes even less sense. The crafting and scripted loot system is terrible in this game, which is yet another valid point relating to this point on crafting, and also with the way the developers just didn't place the ammunition correctly to benefit their own sequences. Just the level of misunderstanding on the developers' parts when they're not comprehending their own designs with the combat encounters, and with not even placing the ammunition correctly to show that they understand how they designed their sequences. It only makes the developers' very lackadaisical nature that much more conspicuous. And this chapter just brings all that to light. And going back to the Garador encounter, it's clear they want you to spam flash grenades, but you know another thing I don't understand? In the original version of Resident Evil 4, there was a room you could go to in Chapter 3.3 and Chapter 4.1 that had a rocket launcher in it. I mean, it was a lot better to go for the rocket launcher in Chapter 4.1 because the enemies in that room would despawn, so you could freely gain access to the rocket launcher and the other resources right next to it. But the fact that they put that rocket launcher there, and it was not a rocket launcher restricted to the merchant, is a very cool idea, because in the process of sacrificing any loot you have in your inventory in order to make room for the rocket launcher, you have access to a one-hit kill option on certain bosses. I mean, that right there was a great example of player strategy, being very tactical, like knowing the sections beforehand. Like, the forward knowledge is actually applied a lot better in the original version of Resident Evil 4 to make room for the rocket launcher to use in later encounters. Like, that was a really cool idea. And there were definitely sequences in Resident Evil 4 OG that benefited from the free rocket launcher. I mean, you had the two Garador encounter, you had Vertigo, and you had Salazar. Those are examples that I would list. I mean, I'm sure the free rocket launcher would have worked in other sequences, but they took the time to put that free rocket launcher in there. Why the fuck did this remake not consider doing the same thing? I mean, you're already going to be having very little stuff in your inventory as it is. I mean, have you seen how much space I have in my inventory with the weapons I'm running and the amount of ammunition I'm running, and I'm not carrying healing items around? I'm taking the time to do this. I'm taking the time to clear up space for future loot. And in the process, I therefore have enough space for a rocket launcher. But the fact that the developers didn't even bother putting in a free rocket launcher in this remake, when there are clearly sequences like the 2 Garador encounter or the 2 El Gigante encounter that would have benefited from a free rocket launcher. I mean, it still wouldn't have fixed any of the poor designs present, of course. A free rocket launcher would have just allowed you to skip the poor designs, not actually fix them. Yeah, so it wouldn't have fixed the sections in that regard, but it would have at least made for some kind of tactical strategy that didn't involve the merchant. It would have been complementary to this arbitrary challenge of beat the game without using the merchant if they really feel that the core designs of this game are befitting for no merchant. That right there just makes no fucking sense. I really don't see the logic in restricting the rocket launcher to just the merchant and not putting a free rocket launcher in the actual world itself. It makes no fucking sense why they would favor that. But that covers that particular poor design, and the final poor design worth covering that this chapter has is the over-reliance on exploits. And speaking of which, you're seeing an exploit right now. If you stand within that doorway, the Navistadors will leash and they will not attack you. And also, when they're about to do their long-range attacks, they will be obstructed by an invisible barrier in that doorway that's specific to them. You've got to use that exploit to your advantage for this stupid sequence. I really don't understand what they were trying to accomplish with this sequence. Why did they put so many of these enemies in this one room when this isn't even the official nest of the Navistadors? Yes, I understand that there are smaller nests or accumulations of whatever the hell this biomass is on the walls and on the ground of this room, but this does not represent the nest. The nest you encounter in Chapter 11 is the actual nest that is birthing all of these Navistadors. Yet, for whatever reason, you encounter far fewer Navistadors in Chapter 11 than you do in this one encounter in Chapter 10. How does that make any fucking sense? And you have got to be very careful of this room, by the way. The enemies, they will actually spawn out of the blue when you reach certain thresholds. This was a great example of an arbitrary spawn just by hitting an invisible checkpoint that triggers the enemies to spawn. Like, what am I in? The older Call of Duty games? Because I recall in the older Call of Duty games, they had like infinite spawns that occurred that you had to disrupt by progressing forward. And also there were moments in the older Call of Duty games where your allies would not push forward unless you reached a specific threshold of a room. And they started moving away from this in the later games, I believe. I mean, certain Call of Duty games reverted back to this older, outdated model, and I don't understand why. But this is 2023, and new Capcom is favoring this arbitrary spawn moment. This moment that makes absolutely no fucking sense, where you just go to certain thresholds of a room and enemies just spawn out of the blue in front of you, behind you, below you, above you. How does that make any fucking sense? Well, why would they put such a mechanic in when this is supposed to be a survival horror game? I don't remember Resident Evil 4 OG relying upon this outdated design. I mean, it was probably there in a few encounters, but it was so rare and not that noticeable. And for the most part, all the enemies that appeared when you first entered a room, they would be the only enemies you'd be dealing with. I mean, yes, there would be certain situations where there would be reinforcements if you killed a lot of enemies, but that's at least justified. Here, you're just triggering these arbitrary spawns to occur by just reaching certain thresholds of a room, and there are far too many of these arbitrary spawns. And I had a recording in my Poor Designs, a Resident Evil 4 Remake series, where I'm looking at a corner and I don't see a camouflage Navistador. Soon as I go through a passageway and I see that corner again, there is a camouflage Navistador sitting in that spot. It spawned out of the blue somehow. And there are also moments in my blind playthrough where I'm on the ground level and I'm right near the holes where the Navistadors come from, and you can literally see the Navistador spawning out of the blue when you reach a certain threshold of that ground floor area. And weirdly, if I approach that part of the ground floor from the opposite end by circling around, I wouldn't get the arbitrary spawn so much, but sometimes they would spawn. Like, the fucking programming in this entire section is weird. It is very weird, guys. It shows the developers are just clinging on to old mentalities, or they didn't know how to actually design a game properly, and so they relied upon tricks that developers used back in the 90s era, or back in the 2000s era. That's how fucking dense these developers are when they're resorting to rookie designs like that, and designs that aren't befitting for a Resident Evil game in 2023. This game has not fucking evolved. It's clinging on to the most outdated, rudimentary, archaic, and draconian designs by far. And it's all being brought to light in this stupid section. But you not only have to deal with those enemies, you also have to deal with the camouflaged enemies. And whenever the Navistador camouflage, they change their pigments to match the background of the environment that they're blending within. I do like the idea of that. It's just, if these enemies didn't have so many bad hitboxes and didn't grab you from like 5 feet away, I would appreciate that design a lot more. But as it stands, the camouflage is only there to complement poor designs, not serve as an interesting gameplay mechanic. And with how many times you're going to be restarting the sequence, just trying to memorize the spawns, and also the amount of times you'll probably restart the sequence due to arbitrary spawns, or sometimes where the Navistadors might hit you with a bad hitbox, or they somehow end up being faster than you because they sometimes tend to do this dodge movement when they're in the air to catch up to you. You're not going to appreciate the camouflage designs at all. And another problem with the Navistador is the audio. The Navistadors barely make any noise when they're flying, and I don't understand why. They are almost the same size as Leon. Their wings are pretty large. Why do they barely make any noise? And there were so many moments in my blind playthrough where I thought an area was clear, but you just hear the faintest sound of wings flapping. And a lot of the times the music obstructs the actual sound effects that play when characters are doing actions or enemies are doing actions. And so the amount of times I got caught by a Navistador because I could not hear them properly, it was rage-inducing, to say the least. This game has the worst audio designs I have ever seen in a Resident Evil game by far. There are so many moments where when you restart checkpoint, the audio just muffles for no reason, and there are so many different enemies that have audio problems, like the Navistadors and also the Colmillos. Like I said before in Chapter 9, the Colmillo make absolutely no noise when they're running at you. You can barely hear them just running along the ground or growling or the like. And then with the Navistadors, they barely make any noise when they're flying. And it's so dumb that this occurs. And also, their pathfinding is atrocious when they're actually flying towards you. There are so many moments in these Navistador encounters when they're flying where they get stuck along the geometry and they have a lot of trouble navigating around the geometry. That is just so fucking broken and so badly designed. And these pathfinding issues can force you to just wait until they get out of position to start attacking you, or you're having to like step out into their playable area to ensure they get out from whatever spot they're in, or you're having to just run to different parts to make sure that they're tracking you properly around the geometry. You're putting yourself at unnecessary risk to ensure that they're actually navigating the environment correctly. I really don't understand why they would program a flying enemy like this, or why they would design the environments as such, when it's clear the environments that the Navistadors are put in aren't complementary to how they're designed overall in terms of their movement. They're really fucking broken and so badly designed. And this pathing issue is also the case with other enemies as well, as you've likely seen in the previous chapters of this walkthrough. Oh, also, this door right here, you can also use it as an exploit spot. You don't even have to have the door open. You can actually just touch the door on the other side, and they will just walk away from you. But it's a lot better to have the door open so that you can instantly retreat back into the non-playable area for the Navistadors. The only reason why I don't use this door, even though I'm afforded a greater field of view and I can actually see a bit better, is because there's no invisible barrier obstructing the Navistadors from hitting you when you're in that unplayable area. So if they decide to initiate that long-range attack when they're flying, and that long-range attack covers an absurd amount of range, and also has an absurd amount of phantom range, you cannot use the door's invisible barrier to shield yourself because it's not there. This is why I primarily use this door right here for the exploit, because it's a safer spot to use even though I can't really see the enemies that well. But when I do trigger the enemies to start coming after me, I run back to that door that's on the second floor, and I use it to my advantage. And also try to take this nice and slowly. You can probably get a couple of moments where the Navistadors are just randomly choosing the camouflage, and you also have the scripted ones that are camouflaging. And there are a couple of moments where you can hit the camouflage Navistador and other enemies will spawn, but I don't know if it's dependent upon hitting them or if it's proximity based. Like, do you have to be close to the Navistadors that are camouflaged when you shoot them in order for the other enemies to trigger? I don't really understand. The spawn logic for this entire sequence is fucked. It is badly designed. And I don't know how close I am to finishing this. There's about, like, 9 minutes left, I would say, before I finish the sequence. Oh, and also, when you climb this ladder, there is a camouflaged Navistador right in front of you. Yet when you're looking at this area from other parts of this room, you cannot see the camouflaged Navistador there. This is a camouflaged Navistador that arbitrarily spawns in when you just climb this ladder. And also, be careful when progressing forward to that switch. There can be another arbitrary spawn. Also, I'm paying attention to my HUD to know when Navistadors are active. But I know that because I killed that enemy, another spawn is going to trigger. I mean, look at this. Like, what am I playing at this point? Am I really playing a fucking game at this point? When you're having to just run back after triggering an arbitrary spawn like this to actually get an advantage over the enemies, you know you're playing a game, and you know the developers are not being very intelligent with their enemies. It's pretty much what you're doing all the time in games like Ninja Gaiden 2. Ninja Gaiden 2 has you just trigger arbitrary spawns, then you're running back to a previous area, and you're charging up your weapons so that you can kill them, and just get those precious iframes. And when you're having to spam iframes like crazy, when you're having to just game the system like that, throughout, like, 100% of Ninja Gaiden 2, that just goes to show how badly designed Ninja Gaiden 2 is, and it just seems like this game took influences from Ninja Gaiden in that department, and it doesn't fit the core designs of this game at all. And I don't even know which is worse, this game or Ninja Gaiden 2, but I don't want to think of Ninja Gaiden 2. I hate Ninja Gaiden as a series, and it has one of the most toxic fan bases ever. But let's not talk about that. We've finally gained access to this switch, and we've activated it, so we've got the first door raised. Now we need to go over to the other switch. There really isn't any creativity to this section. I really wish there was a lot more you could do creatively, like shooting certain parts of the environment to get rid of the Navistador, or to open up new paths, something. But instead you're having to go down these linear routes and putting yourself in the danger zone to be encountering these badly designed enemies. And yes, they die fast, but what good is this limited HP on the Navistadors when they have all these other absurd capabilities, and there are this many of them? I mean, it's just not a well-designed sequence. And spending 30 minutes on this section trying to ensure consistency because of how inconsistent and badly designed the Navistadors are just goes to show the underlying issues present with this entire sequence. But right now, I'm not entirely sure what I'm trying to do right now. I think I'm trying to dispatch these camouflaged Navistador from a different part of the room because I know that I have to get past them if I'm going to gain access to that switch over there. And there are some camouflaged Navistador on the ground of that walkway area, and there are some that are on the walls. You can take out some of them from this walkway that I'm at right now, but it doesn't really help in the end because there's still the arbitrary spawn of enemies to deal with. And again, like, why are there this many enemies? This is what I never understand about people. Like, how can they think that putting in this many enemies is somehow befitting for survival horror? And I just don't understand what New Capcom was thinking with this entire section. And why have this be our first encounter with the Navistadors? Why have this be a mindless shooting gallery moment? where you're just dispatching the Navistadors from an exploit spot, and it's like you're in a shooting gallery moment, and they kind of attack you, and then you have to run the gamut with arbitrary spawns and all these other bullshit designs. I really wish this was a stealth encounter. I mean, you've given them this camouflage capability, and the camouflage capability is actually interesting compared to the original version of Resident Evil 4, where they just went full-on invisible, and you could actually see the drool coming out of their mouths, which was the main indication you had as to where they were. And the invisibility wasn't so much of a problem in the original version of Resident Evil 4, but the invisible Navistador in the original version of Resident Evil 4 were a pretty bad enemy because of their capability of just transitioning between walls and the ceilings, and when they were on the walls, they could be very bullshit with their hitboxes. And when they were on the ceiling, they could catch you out so quickly. Your sprint speed just wasn't fast enough to get past the ceiling attack that they do. And also, when you were fighting multiple of them, it could be very awkward. I feel like when Resident Evil 4 OG introduced the flying Navistadors, they were way better. The flying Navistadors in the original version of Resident Evil 4 could die instantly if you shot them out of the air. Regardless of your methodology, if you shot them out of the air, they would instantly die. And when you're putting in this many enemies in this remake, this kind of mechanic feels warranted for actually dealing with this many enemies. If they actually brought in this mechanic from the original version of Resident Evil 4, I would not hate this sequence so much. And it would not drag out, it would not be so fucking tedious, it wouldn't feel like so much of a slog. But no, they had to make them generic enemies that you just mindlessly shoot, and there are so many of them in this one room for no reason. It's just there to waste your time. And you can try your best to run past all of them to get to the switches, but you just cannot get to the switches efficiently if there are this many Navistador around, and they will crowd up against you, and they will just ambush you the moment you come out of those animations of pulling the switches, or before you even get to the switches. And then with the arbitrary spawns, when they're just arbitrarily spawning camouflage Navistador out of the blue, that's yet another artificial design that just doesn't complement the idea of running past them. They clearly want you to kill all the Navistador in the sequence, but if this is the case, why the hell do you make this a very stale, boring, repetitive, mind-numbing experience for the player to go through? Once again, it's just a mindless shoot-em-up encounter with too many fucking enemies. How the hell is this befitting for challenge? How the hell is this befitting for survival horror? How the hell are you trusting the player to deal with this many enemies using your crappy combat systems? And look, you have another spawn right there, because that guy was camouflaged, and then there's going to be other enemies to your sides and around you when you're going through the sequence. Are you really trusting the player to handle the sequence this poorly and just realize that you're in a fucking game? And that you're having to game the system so much and use exploits because this game has the most incompetently assembled combat designs I have ever seen in a game, and in a Resident Evil game overall. I hate to see what these developers are like if they're releasing consoles or computer products. They're like a crappy computer technician who creates a computer that's filled with like viruses, crashing, graphics errors, all these kinds of issues, and yet he still releases it to the public. And he's like, oh, you need a special touch if you're going to actually handle this product. That's what this entire sequence feels like. That's what new Capcom is representing themselves as. And they seem to take pleasure from this. They seem to take pleasure from making themselves look like fools. And not just in like the gameplay, but also in the character department and the story department. I mean, just the way the characters act in this game, they're just so out of character most of the time, and you've already seen my reactions in my blind playthrough to how out of character Leon is, to how annoying Ashley is, to how much Ada's voice actress is not very good, and the other stupid things that she says, or like with Luis just cracking jokes all the time. Same with Leon cracking jokes all the time, because that's apparently the core trait worth stomaching when you're talking about these kind of characters. Or with how fucking absurd the story is to the point where it doesn't even feel like there's a story in this game. And they're embracing this black liquid stuff. They have crimson flames, blue flames. They have this like superior species plaga that we never see. We have the black liquid that for some reason has relevance to the Las Plagas and doesn't make any fucking sense. And the black liquid is completely forgotten about when Leon is curing Ashley of her ailments when they get to the final chapter of the game. I mean, just so many fucking terrible decisions involved with the story. And it makes no sense how Resident Evil 4 OG's story was crafted over the span of 2 weeks, which was a shortcoming because of the fact that they ran out of time in development. And yet somehow, the story feels better designed in every possible department than the story on this game. And they had plenty of time to devote to the story, but it really feels like the story of this game was constructed over a matter of days. Not in like a matter of months or years or anything like that. Everything that I have just listed is just evidence that new Capcom wants you to view this game as a fucking joke, and view them as fucking jokes as well. And they take pleasure in this. I mean, a great example of this is that 3-episode anime series that they released before Resident Evil 4 Remake released to the public. And they just made a mockery of themselves, and they turned this game into a joke with that 3-episode anime series. Like, why would they waste funding with that? Why don't you actually devote those funds to refining your core gameplay and actually making sure the game fucking works? And I know some fucking retards are gonna be like, oh, it's a skill issue. Oh, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, but I'm pretty sure a vast majority of those comments are just bots, because a lot of people just say skill issue in the comments, or a lot of people just say, laugh my ass off, why are you so angry? In like the same wording and the same grammatical structures, so it leads me to believe it's just a bunch of bots trolling me. They're not actually real people. So that's why their comments have no fucking value, because they're just bots if they're gonna be repeating that same structuring of their wording. That's the only thing I can think of as to why they're saying that, and they clearly didn't watch the video. Bots can't watch videos. People watch videos, and if people were watching videos, they would leave a bit more substance with their comments, but they don't even do that. But I need to pause in this tangent right now. We now have the most abysmal encounter in this game, among other abysmal encounters, but this one really takes the seat as being the worst encounter in the entire game, and it is the 2 Garador encounter. If you do not have 6 flash grenades, or if you don't have a rocket launcher from the merchant, this is a fucking shit show of an encounter. And I've already gone into so much detail of how badly designed this entire sequence is in my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series. In fact, if you've watched my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series, you'll know that this recording that you're seeing right now was actually in my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series. The only reason it's here is because this was the actual successful recording, and it only got into my Poor Design series because I was originally intending this recording to be a part of the Poor Design series, thinking that I wouldn't actually succeed, but because I did succeed, I then made a save afterwards and made this part of the walkthrough. So that's why the footage is identical and it's the same. So if you've already watched this segment in my Poor Designs of Resident Evil 4 Remake series, you'll already know what I'm going to say. There are too many fucking enemies in this encounter. The number of enemies that you're dealing with isn't justified whatsoever. The Garadors are so fucking omniscient. They have so much phantom range. These Ganado right here, they can spam grab. They also can be aggressive when they want to be. They also choose to have their AI be turned off for no reason. They get stuck around corners. There are a lot of moments where if you go to certain parts of this area, their AI acts very strangely with their pathing. And in some cases, you can probably use this to your advantage to slow the enemies down or make them stand still so that the Garadors can actually attack them. But if the reinforcements spawn in, you have to re-engage that process, and it's just awkward to do when there are this many enemies. The Garadors have phantom range on every single one of their hits. They also have a lot of trouble navigating the environment, and this can screw with strategies because you expect them to go down the simple short route, but a lot of the times they choose to take the long route, and because they barely make any noise when they're running at you and you have the other audio obstructing their own running animation audio, it really becomes a frustrating experience trying to track them down and ensure that they're following the rules of the game. Also, whenever Garadors are attacking other enemies, they can't instantly kill the enemies, which would have been perfectly complementary to the number of enemies that you're dealing with. I feel like the developers only put these enemies here just to give the player some kind of ammunition, because the Garadors have so much life. And rather than strategically place ammunition throughout this environment, they instead opt to tie the ammunition to poorly designed enemies, and there's not even a guarantee that they'll drop ammunition, because a lot of the times they'll drop treasure. I mean, the drop frequency of ammunition's greater during the sequence, but why they still drop treasure, I just don't understand. The treasure here is just there to troll you when you need ammunition desperately. But going back to what I was saying about the Garadors and their inability to kill the enemies, their claws are so neutered on the enemies for no reason, yet they kill you so fast. Also, they're very omniscient. Like, if I were to melee this crate right here silently, or if I were to knife an enemy, or deflect an attack, for some reason, deflecting attacks makes noise on this game, and I don't understand why. The Garadors will run over to the sound location, but other times, they will actually pop directly at you, like they know where you are. It is so fucking bullshit. The Garadors in the original version of Resident Evil 4 never displayed any sense of omniscience. They were a perfectly blind enemy, and it made so much sense. And in this sequence, in the original version of Resident Evil 4, you never encountered this many enemies. You only encountered 2 zealots, and in order to ensure other enemies didn't spawn, you stayed on the bottom area of the arena, and you could just deal with the 2 Garadors that way. And it made for a very skillful sequence because you had to work with limited space if you were going to handle 2 Garadors at the same time. So the amount of intelligence involved with that sequence, there is definitely a greater amount displayed compared to what it's like in this remake. There is little to no intelligence displayed with this entire encounter in the remake, and the number of times you are going to get fucked by poor designs on the AI, on their hitboxes, and on their behavior overall. It's just a recipe for disaster, all indicative of a very broken, rushed product that was not QA tested properly. Oh, and also, there is one Plaga-type Guadagna and one Plaga-type Mandibula that can spawn during the sequence. And the Plaga-type Guadagna can die fairly fast from the Garador, but not this Plaga-type Mandibula right now. You're gonna see it right here. You're gonna see just how much of a beating these Plaga-type Mandibulas take. Also, I forgot to mention that the Ganados in this sequence, they're forced to walk, but I really don't understand why. There's really no justification for it because the Garadors ignore their sounds anyway. They can sprint, they can talk, they can collide their weapons with the geometry and make all sorts of noise, and the Garador will not go for them. Yet, if you even do something as simple as just knifing an enemy, it makes noise. Or if you deflect an attack, it makes noise that the Garadors can recognize. That kind of artificial handicap for this sequence to provide some kind of artificial fake difficulty when they're having to take that kind of gamey route with creating a supposedly difficult experience that's not difficult. It's just fucking cheesy, arcadey, and downright stupid. That just goes to show how lazy the developers were when designing the sequence. Oh, and also watch this. Watch this Plaga-type Mandibula take so many hits from the Garador's claws. You have to wonder how the hell this Garador is this neutered against this type of enemy. It's not even flinching, and all it's doing is firing its range attack at me. And it's just shrugging off those hits like they're nothing. It looks so fucking dumb. I seriously do not understand why they feel this is befitting for a game, or why they feel this isn't goofy or silly in the slightest, or why they feel this is complementary to a functional gameplay experience. The number of opportunities this enemy type has to hit me, or the number of times it can just catch me out of the blue, because it just has this resilience against the Garador for no reason. I just don't understand what they were trying to go for with that. But going back to what I was saying about the enemies and their slow movement, they walk through this area and they mainly seem to try to rush you whenever you fire your gun or whenever the Garadors are in the middle of attacking. And again, based on what I've already said, it doesn't really make sense for them to walk. But also, this kind of behavior that the enemies display during the sequence also presents with some kind of abnormality in their programming, where if you stand by very specific pieces of geometry, when you lure the enemies to one side of the room and you go over to the other side, they slow down or they stop moving entirely. And I tried my best to find some way to use this abnormality to my advantage, but nothing was working. So instead, I'm just going to run the gambit, and I'm just going to immediately kill the first armored Garador with flash grenades by exposing its parasite with a gunshot, and then hitting the parasite with a flash grenade when it's exposed. And I repeat this process 3 times until it dies. And I don't even think this Garador right here took damage from the flash grenades. The ambiguity on how the damage from the flash grenades is calculated when you're using it against the Garadors' weak spot is pretty confusing. But every single time I have used the 3 flash grenades, whenever its weak spot was exposed those 3 times, it has always died. So it takes a minimum of 3 flash grenades in order to kill Garadors. So at minimum, you need 6 flash grenades in order to effectively do this sequence. And the only possible way you're going to get that many flash grenades is through crafting, or if you're having to resort to even more rigid methods, if you're not using the merchant to get crafting. And the crafting recipes, I don't even understand why they're forced into the merchant when they're that integral to the natural flow of gameplay. This was also a problem in Resident Evil Village, where for some reason, a lot of fundamental crafting recipes were locked behind the Duke, even though Ethan could actually craft those same ammunition types in Resident Evil 7 without the need to visit an external source. And honestly, the crafting thing and the merchant balancing is even worse in this fucking game. I seriously cannot believe they could make a game worse than Resident Evil Village when it comes to balancing. And just to draw a comparison between Resident Evil Village and Resident Evil 4 Remake, crafting was absolutely needed for Resident Evil Village, and I feel like the crafting system in Resident Evil Village is miles better than the way the crafting system is handled in Resident Evil 4 Remake. And people like to say that Resident Evil Village's crafting system is so overpowered, but it's not when you actually consider the other core designs of the gameplay. The crafting might seem overpowered, but that's only because of how bad the balancing is in Resident Evil Village. Like, so many enemies in Resident Evil Village take an absurd amount of a punishment. There are, like, very little flinch animations in Resident Evil Village. And there are a lot of moments in Resident Evil Village where you had to rely upon an absurd amount of mines, an absurd amount of flash grenades. I mean, not really an absurd amount of flash grenades. I feel like the number of flash grenades you could craft wasn't that absurd. And you also had to craft a lot of sniper rifle ammo as well for later encounters. So the main thing I'm trying to say with Resident Evil Village is that its crafting is not overpowered, it's complementary to the game's systems. And the thing you should be critiquing is the game's systems, not the actual crafting system. Whereas in Resident Evil 4 Remake, the crafting system just supersedes a lot of fixed ammo drops, and when the developers aren't even being intelligent with the way they're placing static drops in the environment, it just goes to show that they're being very over-reliant upon crafting, but a lot of the resources that you need for handling sequences are locked behind the merchant, and it just makes me wonder why the crafting recipes are hidden behind the merchant. And also, if you even think about crafting supplies too early, you're not going to have enough ammunition for later sequences. Like, on my first restart of Resident Evil 4 Remake for my first playthrough, I was crafting nothing but pistol ammo, and then a lot of sequences came up where I needed shotgun ammo, and the game wasn't giving back many resources, unfortunately, because a lot of the resources were just tied to random drops. And then on my second replay of Resident Evil 4 Remake for my first playthrough, I was crafting nothing but shotgun shells. Like, as soon as I got enough resources to craft shotgun shells, I just immediately crafted them. And I fucked myself for Chapter 7 with that double switch sequence for Ashley and for the later encounters that demanded pistol ammo. But of course, I didn't even restart that playthrough. I just continued on with the blind playthrough. But the pacing of the encounters suffered greatly because of the fact that I was crafting too early. And this is the strange predicament this game is in when it comes to crafting. There are a lot of sequences on this game that really feel like crafting is mandatory, and then there are other times where the developers don't even want you to craft because it affects later progress because of the way the drops work on this game. And also with how badly designed later encounters on, with forcing a very specific resource upon you, like what I've already mentioned with the double switch sequence in Chapter 7, where it is mandatory that you have a lot of pistol ammo, because there are too many enemies, they barely flinch, and you have to have a lot of ammo if you're going to rescue Ashley if she gets grabbed, because there are random stuns on the enemies when they're grabbing Ashley, which is fucking bullshit. And then there are sequences that, for instance, they might force flash grenades upon you, or they're rigidly designed with the flash grenades in mind. Of course, this doesn't relate so well to the previous point I was establishing, where there are just times where the developers don't really want you to craft because you can't naturally craft flash grenades without buying from the merchant. But just to talk about this point, if you do not have a flash grenade for, say for instance, the double El Gigante boss fight in Chapter 11, you are fucked. And you'll have to contend with the poor designs on the El Gigante's attacks, their pathfinding issues, the way the room is set up, and the random stuns involved when you're shooting the parasite, because the only way you are going to do that fight is if you incapacitate the unarmored El Gigante by shooting its parasite on top of the blast furnace, and it's random when the stun occurs. And yet, the developers, in their stupidity, didn't even think of putting a flash grenade before that sequence without having to rely upon crafting. And the reason why this is important is that this relays to the player that they designed that sequence with flash grenades in mind. But the fact that the developers aren't even going out of their way to communicate this information properly by putting a static flash grenade drop before that sequence, that just borders on pure stupidity and miscommunication on a whole other level. But I need to pause in this tangent right now because we're fighting Vertigo, or we're just running away from Vertigo. Vertigo, I got on the first try because he is a very, very easy fight. And I don't know which is easier, the fight in the original version or in this remake, but what this encounter boils down to is just running around in a circle like you're playing Ring Around the Rosie. So what you need to do when you first start Vertigo's boss fight and you're in that room is you have to make sure that he attacks first, then activate the liquid nitrogen so he gets stunned. And as soon as he gets hit by the liquid nitrogen, he will retreat back into the ventilation system, and you will be free to open the door. As soon as you get through the door, that's when they cues the cutscene of the elevator coming, and now you have to survive for between 4 to 5 minutes. And this room is the key to this strategy. So before Vertigo has the chance to emerge from the vents, you need to pick up all the loot in this room. Hopefully you get heavy grenades. Luckily for me, I got heavy grenades on this recording. The loot is completely random in these crates, but they're always guaranteed to drop some kind of ammunition. That's definitely one thing I can kinda appreciate about Vertigo's boss fight. You can get back essential loot in the process, and I don't know if there are other crates littered throughout this environment that you can actually loot before Vertigo has the chance to emerge from the vents. But this was the only spot that I could find that had crates once you actually got the power back on. But to describe this strategy, you need to go to this room. You then need to move around this piece of geometry in a clockwise direction. And Vertigo can choose to walk at you. He can also choose to run at you. And also, you saw that tail attack just then? This is the reason why you go clockwise. It's because when he tries to attack you through the geometry with that tail attack, the attack will be neutralized. And the same goes for his other attacks as well, and some of his hitboxes are really bad. Like, there is one attack that he does where he will ready himself, and then he will launch his tail at you in a single strike. It looks like an attack you can crouch under, and in certain situations you can crouch under it, but there are times where the hitbox is really bad because he can hit you with phantom range even when you crouch under it. And right now, he's not doing his long-range attacks, he's doing his close-range attacks. And also, you'll want to position yourself widthwise in relation to this piece of geometry. Do not expose yourself to Vertigo lengthwise in relation to this piece of geometry. You'll want to remain on these ends of the geometry before Vertigo has the chance to see you and start this attack. That way, you have plenty of time to get behind cover. Oh, also, that's the tail attack right there. You saw that? That's the move that it looks like you can crouch under, but a lot of the times you can't because of really bad detection. And I'm pretty sure his other attacks have really bad detection. Like, there is a long-range grab that he does where he does a front flip towards you. And it looks like you should be able to crouch and move under it, but you actually can't. And also, the grab has phantom range as well. And he can also use that move to close the distance to you when you're trying to run away from him. And really, the only random part to Vertigo's boss fight is getting to the elevator, because you don't have any cover as you're making your way over to the elevator, and you have to run the gamut with his long-range attacks. And really, the only bad long-range attacks worth noting are his grab and his swipe move that he does with his right arm. Every other attack is fine, but to talk about the attacks that he's doing in this part, whenever he runs at you, he's mainly going to do his close-range attack, and this can be a kick, this can be a swipe, this can also be the tail attack that lasts for a long time, but it can be neutralized by the environment, and there it was just then. And again, always make sure that you are positioning yourself widthwise in relation to the geometry so that you have plenty of time to get back into cover so that Vertigo doesn't hit you with his attacks. So the elevator has arrived, so I'm going to position Vertigo over here, and then this is when I need to run. And then this is where the RNG begins. If Vertigo decides to do a really douchey attack that covers a lot of range, it catches up to me very quickly, I'm fucked. Don't even bother using the liquid nitrogen. It'll slow you down. Not to mention, it's very awkward to use because there's a sense of directionality in the way Leon moves while he is interacting with the button. So if you move in one direction and you hit the button, Leon will do an animation where he will keep moving in that direction while he's pressing the button. And at times, the game can read your direction incorrectly because of how weird the detection is when you're actually trying to press the button. So you're trying to move Leon around to make sure the detection is working, and in the process he's doing the wrong button press animation that might cause him to run into Vertigo, and you might get hit by one of his attacks. But keeping that in mind, this is a very simple encounter, but I will say it was a very awkward encounter in my blind playthrough because I didn't really understand how his moves worked, and all it took was just hiding behind corners and just moving like you're in a square or rectangle arena, and I was able to deal with Vertigo very easily. And with all that done, that pretty much concludes this crappy chapter that personifies just how incompetent this development team is compared to every other development team out there. But before I conclude the commentary, I just want to acknowledge a comment from one of my subscribers talking about the setup for Vertigo. There is no setup, actually, and I find it really stupid how Leon gets thrown down that hole and conveniently there is a chain for him to grab, and it just feels like such a lucky pass moment, whereas in the original version of Resident Evil 4, Leon came prepared for such situations. He had a grappling hook on his belt, and he was able to survive the fall. And it's complementary to the amount of training he's received, his character traits, and the fact that he's actually clever, unlike in this remake version where Leon is so incompetent, he has to rely upon the hand of fate to survive these kind of situations, just by having a chain magically appear there for some reason. Why the hell would Leon not have a grappling hook for these kind of situations, or some way to survive precarious falls like this? That actually feels complementary to the amount of training he's received. Once again, the whole setup this remake provides with saying that Leon has gone on all these punishing missions, yet through those punishing missions, he ended up being the most incompetent character ever in the entire Resident Evil series. It's just so fucking dumb. And also, why the hell is Vertigo even here? There is no setup for Vertigo appearing here in this facility. Somehow, Salazar knew that Leon survived, and because of this, he then decided to send Vertigo. We're never given any indication of this, whereas in the original version of Resident Evil 4, Salazar, being the sadistic individual that he is, wanted to hear Leon being impaled on the spikes. And of course, he didn't hear Leon being impaled on the spikes, and then Leon announced his presence by shooting the ear hole that Salazar was using in order to hear the sound of Leon potentially being impaled. And Salazar got very furious with Leon, and so this is what caused him to send that one Vertigo after him. The setup made so much sense, but here, there is no setup. Vertigo just appears out of nowhere. I cannot believe this didn't occur to me when I first came across the sequence on my blind playthrough. That comment that my subscriber left is very valid. Yet another example of this remake taking shortcuts and just not making any sense with the way the screenplay plays out. Yeah, that was a comment definitely worth mentioning in this video. But with all that said, that is the end of this really crappy chapter. Stay tuned for the future chapters. Thank you all for watching, and you take care now.